we've worked hard over the last few years to do really nice foundational learning for Houdini. Being able to have it be more approachable, have junior artists and artists at any level, but artists that haven't used Houdini use it for the first time and be successful. And we've done that, I think, pretty well. But one area that we've wanted to really expand into is these production level courses and projects that showcase Houdini in some more advanced workflows. Still have it be approachable, still have it be fun and usable, but more advanced than the basic stuff. And so we started with Project Titan last year, where then that's available at sidefx.com/Titan. It's kind of a new age, futuristic Amsterdam kind of city, and we built some tool sets and some learning material around that project. That was great, and it was really well received, and so we wanted to continue that approach with more of an open world project. And so we spoke with Ian earlier this year, and he was gracious enough to accept the title of lead on the project, and has been moving along with that. And we wanted to show you where we're at with that right now. So over to Ian.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this last day, early in the morning. So my name is Ian. I'm a CG Supervisor at an animation studio in the UK called NSC Creative, but I also freelance as an artist. So for the last few months, I've been working with SideFX as kind of lead on Project Pegasus. So as Chris said, this project is designed to explore kind of different game development workflows using Houdini and Unreal. And we're very much working, kind of walking in the footsteps of Project Titan. So we want to explore different workflows using Houdini with Unreal Engine, document that process, break it down, and then release learning material along with all of the project files. So this is still an active project. So what you're going to see is kind of a sneak peek, work in progress look at all that we've done so far. During this presentation, I'll introduce the Pegasus team, let you know who we are, give a bit of a background to the project so you can have an idea of how we've arrived at where we currently are. And then I'll touch on some of the kind of main topics that Project Pegasus is going to be covering. So we're a team of 5 Houdini artists. Each of us has kind of a general area of focus, although there's been a lot of crossover and collaboration amongst the team on kind of all the different areas. So Alex is a postgraduate, currently doing their master's degree. And he actually joined us only a few weeks ago to focus on some volumetrics and clouds. Fika has experience creating procedural cities, buildings, roads, and their focus on Pegasus has been on procedural buildings. But they've also contributed greatly to some really exciting foliage tools that we've been developing. George joined us to focus on landscapes, but also kind of took on a challenge of creating the new foliage tools that I've just mentioned. And then Tillman is an experienced technical artist, working on environment art, vegetation, and pipeline. And they've been working on some procedural assets and been using a lot of his experience as kind of vegetation artist to help drive and push the functionality of the foliage tools. And then for myself, I've been working on workflows for procedural props, environment art, as well as the project lead. So I'll come back round to some of those tools that we've been working on. But first, I'll give a bit more context to Project Pegasus. So this is the timeline, well, a very high-level view of the timeline. So I had an initial kickoff meeting in mid-May with Chris, and I kind of presented my initial idea and concept of what I wanted to kind of produce, and then began developing the Blockout. From this, I drew up a list of kind of specialized areas such as foliage, landscape, buildings, and started to kind of build the Pegasus team based on those needs. And then during Alpha, we focused on just experimentation. So we didn't have a specific remit of what we wanted to use Houdini for. So we just kind of experimented, put everything on the table and just kind of let the team run with them. And then during beta phase, we began refining and selecting a few of the workflows and tools that we thought were working well. And then we could begin to kind of refine the scope of the project to meet our goals. And then we'd move on to Polished, where we'll finish developing the tools and the workflow and kind of filling in any gaps that we haven't covered with Houdini with kind of supplementary assets. And then finally, we'll move on to documentation. So breaking down the tools and the workflows, preparing sample files and learning material, and then to release the project. So this is currently where we are. We're currently in beta, and then we're hoping to move on soon to polish. Our hope is to finish, we have an internal deadline of around October to kind of finish the environment in the project and then move on to documentation and breakdown. After which we'll kind of need to neatly package everything and release it. So we're looking at sometime later this year for release. So from the beginning, I knew I wanted to create an environment, a natural environment, kind of focusing on landscapes with mountains and forests and vistas. This is what I'm kind of drawn to on personal projects, but I also thought it kind of contrasted quite nicely with last year's Project Titan, which was very sci-fi, kind of cyberpunk. So this also aligned with a lot of the topics that SideFX team were working on and some of the new features were coming in Houdini Engine. So we went in this direction of a kind of natural setting with a bit of a fantasy, kind of medieval vein. A lot of the initial reference I gathered was for the Scottish Highlands, kind of very dramatic locations that felt remote and unexplored. And then for the architecture, I didn't want to stick to anything too specific, but keep something that kind of felt a bit fictional. And this was an isolated island with an isolated community of people that used to live here. So I began blocking out the island. I didn't want anything that was like too enormous and too massive, but I still wanted something that had kind of plenty of room to kind of expand it into if we needed to. The landscape was built in Houdini, layering different levels of erosion and noises, with some basic input geometry to help create the hero shapes, like the mountains and the kind of general shape of the island. And this is all done using Houdini Session Sync so that I could kind of create changes in Houdini and see them update directly in Unreal. So this way I could kind of fly around Unreal, kind of location scout where I wanted the main like gameplay area to be, and then kind of push and continue to develop the shape and design of the landscape. And so this is kind of what I ended up with for that blockout phase. So we're kind of focusing on like one small island, corner of the island. So it's a bit like a vertical slice. So we've got the whole island, which we kind of plan on set dressing with foliage and rocks and procedural art. And then we have a kind of one worked up kind of gameplay area. So it starts with a path that starts in a bit of a canyon and then leads up to a small village, with a path that leads past a church and then up to this large castle. So we wanted to design something that had plenty of variety and plenty of opportunities to use Houdini, although at the same time I wasn't trying to come at it kind of Houdini first, but rather problems first, so to speak. So when developing the blockout, well, I had an idea of how I could use Houdini. I really just focused on making something that felt cool, felt epic, and had kind of lots of nice vistas and things to explore. And then I could take this blockout and begin to draw up kind of a list of problems that needed solutions. And kind of by the end of the blockout, I'd kind of given myself quite a lot of problems. So we're only a small team, there's 5 of us. The island is roughly 4 kilometers across, which isn't huge compared to kind of modern AAA open world games, but we've only got 3 to 4 months. And I say 4 months-ish because we're all working part-time. So this, in real world terms, we've actually got less than this. But this does force us to approach Pegasus in kind of a very focused and clear way. And these are the kind of main areas that Pegasus is kind of focusing on. So we've got architecture, props, foliage, landscapes, and volumetric clouds. And because we're coming at these problems first, the solutions to kind of each of these different areas has been different. So these solutions have included Houdini digital assets for use directly in Unreal, such as creating procedural buildings or props. And then other workflows have been using Houdini and PDG and TOPS to process a number of basic kind of gameplay blockout assets and produce game-ready art from them. And then also, as I mentioned, kind of during the team introduction, a lot of the team have been working on these different foliage tools. And so it wasn't initially on the cards to kind of, or a specific plan to develop some foliage tools, but the team felt the current options were lacking. And so kind of following that problem, the solution was to develop these tools. And then also with the release of Unreal 5.2, we also wanted to take advantage of PCG, Substrate, and Nanite virtual geometry. And so we're experimenting with workflows using Houdini to utilize these features. So with all that said, we'll get on to looking at some of the kind of things we've been doing. So architecture. So FICO, as I said, has a lot of experience creating procedural buildings and cities. So he's been working on some architecture tools for use inside Houdini. So these are kind of still in early stages of development. This is something that FICO was working on, but then kind of switched track to focus on the Foliage tools. But this is something we've continued to work on. So on the left, we have the basic set of Blockout objects. And then from this, the tool can generate the procedural building you see on the right, with the tool allowing to define basic shapes of the building and kind of areas for the door and windows. And then the user can add additional floors or sub-buildings. And so the next stage for us is to kind of continue developing this tool and replace what we see here with kind of the final artwork. And then to avoid the building intersecting the landscape, we're using PCG in Unreal 5.2. So PCG is Unreal's procedural content generation framework. It can be used to procedurally scatter meshes or scatter meshes or art, or to create tools. So here FICO is using the tool to draw out a spline which projects cubes onto the ground, and then we can reference this into the HDA. So rather than referencing the whole landscape or landscape tile and bringing that to Houdini, which could take some while, we can actually use this to sample a small area of the landscape and just bring what we need into. So what we actually do is reference the cubes that are generated, extract the centroid of each of those cubes to form a grid of points, and from this we can reconstruct that portion of the landscape in Houdini. So in this example, we utilize it to clip the wooden planks so they avoid intersecting with the ground. So these are some interesting ways of using PCG and kind of having it interact with Houdini. So moving on to props. Nanite allows us to kind of have very high detailed geometry, but it does create the problem of having to create a lot of artwork with this high level of detail. So we've been exploring a few different ways of creating artwork in a procedural way, taking basic input and then outputting game-ready assets. So I'm going to play a video and you'll hear from Tillman, who will talk about one of the tools that he's been working on.
Hello, my name is Tillman Mielsch. I'm a technical environment artist with focus on vegetation. I was fortunate enough to join SideFX project Pegasus as a vegetation artist to help develop a new toolset for vegetation that you either already have seen or will see in a bit. But I also took the chance to contribute the tool I've been prototyping for some time now, a semi-generative approach for making wood for environments from tiling textures. I'm pretty bad at sculpting and it takes a lot of time, so I tried to come up with an automated approach to making sculpt-like quality wood. I also tried different methods like displacing cylinders and using cap meshes, but it was always really hard to align the cap with the content of the cylinder and to blend the two together properly. So I tried to come up with a method that works with just one tiling texture as an input. I didn't want to author any cap textures anymore. I didn't want to use cap alphas or anything that complicates the whole process. I wanted to be as simple as possible. You pick a texture from Quixel, or you make one in Substance Designer, or you sculpt the texture and plug it in, and it should just work. And the way this does work is by essentially using two different UV sets. The first one is a cylindrical projection onto the wood, which makes the cracks and grooves in the wood texture converge at the poles of the wooden piece, which in the end essentially is the unifying element between cap and sides. And a second UV set that is transformed to be a more like polar coordinate system. It's not a real Cartesian to polar transform, but the result looks like it. And this way you can create wooden rings from the anisotropic grain of your wood texture. And these two are blended together to create the cap displacement. And it works really nicely. And in the end, you get out 2 different UV sets that you can use in your shader to blend them together to get a relatively decent cap texture. In environment art or in environment pieces of wood, you usually are restricted to modular kits because you cannot have like 50 baked down pieces of wood in your scene. And it requires a lot of pre-planning and knowing ahead of time what you need in your environment. It's pretty hard to keep consistency if you need to add pieces later. And with this method or with this tool, you can on the fly generate wooden pieces for your environments that are based on a single texture that is sampled twice, but it's still a lot cheaper than having a whole modular kit in memory. And by using multiple different textures, of course, you can get some nice variation in there. That makes it a per type cost and not a per mesh cost. So far, you've seen in the background how the tool generates wood pieces from scratch. You can just drag it into an Unreal project or into a Houdini scene and create a wood piece from a straight shape and displace it with noise and the texture, of course. But the tool can do more. It can also convert input shapes into wood. And it can do so at any arbitrary transform, rotation in space. It can do so for any convex shape by default without any further setup necessary. However, it can also do concave shapes, and for this it needs a sort of guide geometry that you can see in the background here. And once it has a convex guide, it can also convert concave shapes. That goes for Boolean shapes as well, especially for wood logs. You often have them carved out so they fit better together. It also can convert deformed shapes into wood. However, there's one limitation to it. The deformation needs to be planar or on limited to one plane. So wooden arcs and all sorts of wooden bent shapes are not a problem either. Typically, wood isn't wiggled around a lot like a noodle. It's more deformed in one direction, like a bent arc or a walking cane or stuff like that. And all of that is possible with this. With these abilities of converting pieces at any arbitrary transform in space and any arbitrary deformation, as long as it's constrained to one plane, the tool can be used to essentially convert any sort of input that conforms to these rules into a final wooden mesh. You can see some examples here. Initially, I constructed this tool with wooden walls and plank walls and fishing piers and that sort of environment stuff in mind. And this is already more than I ever was able to achieve in ZBrush. But within the scope of this project, we also wanted to see if it can do props. And it turns out it can. However, of course, a wooden prop is not a log wall. And to achieve the sort of fidelity and quality you would have from a custom sculpt ZBrush prop with a Substance Painter pass, you cannot achieve that fully procedurally. But you can use this as a base, maybe for a further sculpting pass and to bring it into Substance Painter and give it another texturing pass. You can make the textures from scratch. You can also use the tiling textures as sort of a base to work off of. And of course, you can use this in a more traditional workflow and use this generated high poly to bake down to a low poly. But I conceptualized this tool specifically with nanite in mind trying to tackle some of the challenges that Nanite imposes on us. For instance, how do we texture high poly pieces? How do we utilize the newly won freedom from draw calls and instancing? Since being confined to modular pieces had also the positive effect of not having to author endless amounts of content. And how do we keep world building responsive in times of ever increasing content fidelity? 20 years ago, you could get away with just texturing relatively low poly cylinder. Nowadays, it's expected to deliver more or less 3D scan quality across the board. But the 3D scan content in the Megascans library, for instance, is still relatively limited. There's not a scan for everything. However, the 2D scan library is really extensive, and with some simple Photoshop or Affinity Photo clone tooling, you can mix and match a lot of the 2D scans that are available. And methods like this, where 2D scans are utilized to author 3D content, are a really good approach in times to author scan quality content at scale. So thanks for watching and listening, and I'm really excited to get this tool out in the wild.
So a tool like this allows users to take kind of the very basic input assets and then output something that could be a game-ready nanite mesh. So in a similar vein, I'm going to move on to a workflow for using PDG and TOPS for processing a set of blockout models and props and outputting kind of a large number of game-ready assets. So here we begin with a blockout mesh on which I can define two different materials, one for stone and then one for kind of this center metal plate. And I can do this for a large number of assets, kind of prep these assets to work with this kind of workflow. And then within this workflow, I can kind of bring in one of these props, split off the two different sections for the two different materials, and begin to apply procedural detail. So on the stone sections, I can add edge damage, cracks, and some kind of procedural moss that starts growing on the kind of top surfaces. And then over on the other side, I can begin applying procedural detail for the metal. So this kind of, I'm going to give this kind of hammered metal look. And then once I've added these details, I can bring these back together. And then here I'm using the labs connectivity and segmentation node to split the geometry into segments and then using UV flatten to flatten out those segments. So it's not a particularly intelligent way of doing the UVs, but it's something that works really quickly on high poly geometry. And then I'm defining a couple of different maps that I'm baking out. So one is an ID mask that defines where I want the three different materials to be, so the moss, the stone, and the metal. And then also this detail mask. So this is a small kind of utility that we built. So it takes the kind of side effects labs, ambient occlusion, measure curvature node, and thickness node, and kind of combines them together into this one tool, so we can choose where we want those detail masks to be in any one of the vertex color channels, and then we can bake this map out. And then this whole workflow can be set up in a PGG network, so I can have a wedge for each one of my props, and then just hit cook, and it will output for each one of my meshes a game-ready asset and all of its textures. And then here are the assets in Unreal. So we're using substrate for materials. So using the ID map that I've baked out to combine three different substrate slabs for the stone, moss, and metal, combine them together, and then use those detail masks to add some additional breakup details to kind of the edges and the cavities of the model. And then the materials are all using tri-planar projection for the textures. So this way I can kind of scale up the model or shrink it down, move it around, and kind of get a very consistent level of detail. So moving on to the Foliage tools. So as I said, a lot of work has gone developing these tools for Project Pegasus. You're going to hear from George, who initially prototyped these tools and kind of defined the way he wanted them to work. And then Fika took those tools and kind of ran with them and just kind of developed them to where they are now, with George and Tillman kind of contributing to feedback to help push and define the kind of needs of the tools. So I'll hand over to George and then Fika to talk about these tools.
My name is George Hume. I'm a freelance technical artist and educator. I'm a university lecturer and I also teach on YouTube. And on top of that, I am plant obsessed. So my responsibilities on Project Pegasus were primarily related to the landscape and ground cover, but that gradually grew into and included some foliage tooling as well. So I've spent a large part of the last 4 years thinking about how to model the most realistic possible real-time foliage. And I've tried a bunch of different approaches, and the result of all of that R&D is led into the tooling that we're building for foliage that we're kind of calling Flora for the time being. Why did we decide we wanted to build our own tooling? And basically that just stemmed from a dissatisfaction with any of the off-the-shelf solutions for creating real-time plants in Houdini. And we basically thought that as a team we had a pretty good shot at making something that was pretty extraordinary. So the approach itself is driven by, is inspired by botanically driven approaches, but given that I leaned very, very heavily down that path in the past, I wanted to learn from some past mistakes there and really try to combine some of the best features of things like L systems and space colonization with direct modeling tools, whilst still keeping that kind of very botanically grounded approach to how we make plants. So the idea was called Flora State Machine, at least that's the kind of what we're calling it for the time being. And it's called a state machine because it sort of more closely resembles an animation state machine for a character than it does just like a simulation black box or like a more traditional modeling approach. So the overall process is a recursive process of growing over a set number of steps, and at each step there's a sort of a measuring of the state of the stem and of the environment, and then that leads to the module that gets picked that makes up the resulting form of the plant. The user builds themselves the state machine to describe a species using these nodes, so component being a fork, a stem, a branch, control allowing you to sort of have ramps to control properties of the plant across a bunch of time and space, and then the other ones as well, sort of giving you high-level controls over what if this, then what kind of events in the plant's life. So I built the initial prototype, and we thought it was pretty promising, given that it was quite quick to get to a result that felt like it was going in a good direction. But then I ended up falling into some stumbling blocks and sort of basically ending up caught between wanting to fulfill my other Pegasus duties and wanting to try and crack the problems that I was having. And essentially I decided to give it up. But very fortunately, Fika, an absolutely incredible technical artist with some amazing skills, decided to have a shot at the system. And he rebuilt it from scratch. And that's where we are now working with him as the sort of primary developer of the system. So you can see some of the tooling here. You can see that it's kind of interacting with its environment and even with itself. And also the whole tooling is very close to running in real time, even with all of these complex simulations happening. So this tree is probably living to about 30 steps, which might be considered kind of like years. And then at each step, it's reacting to its environment, and that's giving us the eventual final model. Where this differs from a true simulation or pure simulation is that you have extremely detailed and fine-grained control over every aspect of the simulation. And what that helps you do, having the kind of power of a modeling tool with the power of a simulation, is you can very quickly resolve to these results that are very sort of botanically inspired, very realistic looking. Some kinds of details that might be quite tricky to kind of bake into a model using other approaches. So I'm very, very excited. I could ramble on and on about this for hours, but Fika is going to talk to you in a lot more detail about how the system actually works and how we use it. So I will happily pass it over onto him.
Hey guys, my name is Fika Bosmes. I'm a technical artist and I am joining Pegasus to do some foliage and architecture. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the foliage tools, which is Flora. It's 4 nodes. And Flora is really meant to generate foliage. My focus is mainly to do the main structure of the trees. That's what I will be talking about right now. So we have the 4 nodes. 4 nodes are a component node, a solver node, a control node, and a select node. Now you have to think about it as we have one solver node and then a bunch of other nodes which basically just do a bunch of logic. Flora is a solving technique. So we input a bunch of rules, a bunch of logic, and then each generation we execute that logic. Here's a very, very simple setup of one main stem, which basically has the logic of try to grow upwards, and every generation spawn again till a maximum amount. So a very simple set of logic to basically get one stem or branch. On top of this, we can add another branch, which adds immediately a bunch of complexity. This branch is looks at its parent, and it's allowed to spawn on its parent a certain percentage of time. So it has a spawn rule which says only spawn 2 out of 3 times. And already you can see that it creates a bunch of complexity. This is really the core of the Flora toolset. Now here's an example of a way more complex setup. We focus on speed, user experience, and to make sure we are still pretty close to actual botanical rules. So here's an example of a sideways growing branch, which is because of course if you're creating your tree, your foliage, if you're creating your tree, you want to have a lot of control where the branches spawn versus where the main tree is. Maybe you want to separate those, so you can with a card baker first create a branch and make sure that you're spawning that card on your tree. So lots of flexibility over there. There's a bunch of options because basically every generation you have a lot of simulation options, and this is gravitropism, going between a positive value and a negative value, and you can see it starts to bounce up and down. We have wind. If you set it to the maximum value, the branches will start growing that direction. And we have, of course, some more fancy stuff like phototropism, where our tree detects how much light there is and starts growing into the direction of light. A bunch of different controls, lots of cool options. And then finally, just to give a quick overview, we have a control node, and the control node is this really, really powerful thing which allows you to use any attribute and drive any parameter. So over here we have the distance from the start. So every branch has a certain distance from the start, and we use that to drive gravitropism with a ramp. And that really gives a lot of control to get your tree to get a certain specific shape, for example. Very flexible, very fast, and yeah, very cool thing to use.
So we're all really excited to get these tools out there. It's something that I'm sure George and Feike would love to spend like another 4 months just on these tools. But these have a lot of things they'd still like to add to it. But as they stand, they already provide kind of a great deal of functionality for modding trees in a very natural and realistic way, whilst also providing a great deal of control. So we're just really excited to get them out there, see people using them, and then hopefully develop them even further. And then with the landscape, with the main setting being this large island, it's something we really want to try and push and show off with Houdini and Unreal. So the landscape really started development right from the beginning and really formed the kind of foundation for the Blockout. And George kind of came on to take that foundation and then kind of work it up, put in as much detail as he possibly could. So I'm going to play another video, and George is going to talk through the pipeline, the workflow that we've used for the landscape, and then I'm going to talk about a bit about some procedural cliffs and details that we then added to the landscape.
We can broadly break the landscape up to sort of 3 areas: modeling, texturing, and rendering. So I'm going to go into the modeling first of all. So I took over the landscape from Ian, who created the beautiful base terrain and height map, and I added in layers of procedural detail and some manual editing on top of that, which you can see happening here. So the requirements of a landscape in 2023 are that you need to be able to support both manual and procedural editing. You want to have a non-destructive workflow, and you want to be able to support having multiple collaborators. And of course, high geometric detail, because it is 2023 after all. Fortunately, both Houdini and Unreal have done a lot in recent times to support this kind of workflow. So Unreal Engine has edit layers, which allows you to have multiple layers, just like Photoshop or any other image editing program, which can be added together in different ways. So you can have your source layer, which never changes, as well as multiple kind of transient layers that exist on top of that can get modified. Houdini supports writing to and reading from these layers just fine. And as of very recently, Houdini and well-partitioned play together very nicely. So if you drag in a terrain into a well-partitioned level, it's going to cut it up automatically. And there's a bunch of attributes that you can look at on the website and the documentation now. So you can see here the source plus manual edits, procedural detail, and parts. And I'm going to go through how we kind of did each of these kind of changes. Actually, before I even do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the overarching kind of workflow we used. So this image kind of represents that, where we have our source incoming from outside of this network. And then that source height field gets read both Houdini and Unreal. It lives in a permanent place on disk. There's an HDA that lives in Unreal, which writes the manual edits to disk next to the source. And then Houdini reads from both of those to do the kind of final procedural flourishes on top, which gets read back into Unreal. So we can see the source terrain here. And then basically the first stage of procedural detailing that I did was by using displacement maps from materials to kind of like add some nice chunkiness and details that would be hard to get through noise or just erosion features alone, using a mask to drive the placement of that there. I also did some roads and paths. I should say they're not really roads, they're just paths, using the find shortest path node and a kind of bunch of utilities that I built to kind of help with isolating the costs of different parts of the landscape and traversing different regions. So, for example, you could have paths which avoid going up too steep a slope, but prefer to move through valleys. And you could have the inverse of that, which is they still don't like going up too steep of a slope, but they prefer to go along ridges. And this is great because it allows you to have paths that look like they've been created by different animals or different kinds of, for different purposes. So there are some nodes there to help with achieving different kind of paths on your terrain there. So as for the texturing, this is an area where I've always had a bit of a pet peeve with Houdini, in that I thought there wasn't a nice way to author global color textures. Turns out I was completely wrong, and I recently discovered, thanks to some colleagues at Applied Intuition, that you can simply set up a height field visualize with R, G, and B as the color layer to visualize, and then you set up 3 separate volumes, each reading from the same texture, and those will drive the different channels of the color. So this allows you to work on color with height fields just as if they were regular height field volume layers, and just as if you're working in Substance Designer or something like that. And I really love this workflow. It's very, very cool. We kind of wrapped some of those functions up together. For example, having to put down 3 files to read from one texture might get a bit repetitive. So that's what these utilities are here to help with, just to make authoring color maps in Houdini height fields a little bit easier. Now, like I said before, I'm really excited by this workflow. I really don't think the potentials have been fully discovered here as a kind of Substance Designer alternative. Finally, that brings us on to the rendering of the landscape inside of Unreal, or mostly. So a traditional way to render landscapes is you would have, actually, I've gone ahead a little bit here, but let's keep going, would be to have landscape layer weights. So you write out a bunch of textures, each one representing a different kind of material you'd like to write onto the surface of the landscape. But this can get a little bit expensive because for every single different material, you kind of have to blend an entire material together. So as you add more layers, that multiplies the number of texture samples, the number of layer textures, the number of instructions, and it can get pretty unsustainable for large, complex landscapes. Fortunately, I was recently also led on to by a colleague on the Unreal forums, or should I say an accomplice? I don't know what word I'm looking for, but Deathray is a pretty well-known Unreal community member, and he basically left a breadcrumb trail that led me to this, the layer ID map method, where you basically combine all of those layer weights into a single ID map texture. And that single ID map texture is going to be read only once, and then the value you get from it is going to be used to index into a textured 2D array. And what this means is that instead of having an unlimited number of layer samples that scales with the number of layers you have, actually, no matter how many layers you have, you're only going to have the 1 ID map and the 12 texture samples, assuming you have 4 samples for the color, 4 for normal, and 4 for your other kind of textures. So we also built some nodes here to help with that workflow. So that brings us on to some of the more juicy recent features of Unreal Engine when it comes to rendering landscapes, which are kind of interlinked. We're using virtual height field mesh inside of Project Pegasus, and this is sort of best thought of as a replacement for something like tessellation or parallax occlusion mapping. And it creates a very, very highly subdivided mesh that kind of scales with distance to the player and allows you to inject a lot of rich displacement into the terrain there, which all responds to the lighting very, very nicely. This is made possible by the runtime virtual textures, which essentially are just giant render targets that you can store the landscape data in and read from real time. So you can use these giant textures to read color and height from the landscape. For example, for grass, you might want to blur, to take the color of the terrain and blend that into the grass color, or to offset the position of the grass. And you can also read from decals and meshes into the landscape to create some really cheap rendering of really nice, interesting details into the landscape there. That brings us on to ground cover. So ground cover can be thought of everything sitting on the ground, primarily grass, I suppose. So nothing particularly special about the way we're approaching grass here. But one thing of note is that we didn't just go with random orientation for our grass. We actually have our grass orientations being driven by sort of a global vector field, which is stored in the texture. And so what this allows us to do is create these nice kind of sweeping patterns in the grass that look actually quite a lot more realistic, I would say, than just the random orientation we might be used to. As for authoring the glass clumps inside of Houdini, we just wanted a quick and easy way to quickly generate a bunch of versions of different types of grass. So built a couple of utilities to help with that. And one of them is this little flora tuft splay thing. It allows you to kind of author like a bunch of blades all sticking out at close angles. And then the way that we create the grass bigger clumps and keep it optimized is we basically just go for an iterative or a recursive process of tuft, bake to a card, tuft, bake to a card. So at every stage, you're baking it down to a more simpler polygonal representation, which is suitable for rendering it in real time.
So with that pipeline that you've just seen for how we're using the landscape, where we have these kind of landscape layers cached to disk, it means that we can either bring that landscape into Unreal or into Houdini to create and add additional procedural content. So whether that's scattering objects or generating additional procedural details such as cliffs. So with this workflow, it gives us a lot of flexibility to choose how we want to work with the landscape. So with the cached landscape, which is stored with a number of IDs, these IDs kind of feed into and drive the placement of materials on the landscape in Unreal. So whether that's areas where there's grass, roads, or paths, or cliffs. And so then I can also take that same ID and use that to generate additional procedural content. So here I have a few different HDAs, which are the ones in white. So first you have that HDA that loads in the cached landscape that has all those different layer IDs. And then I can take that ID for the cliffs and convert that into geometry. Each cliff is split up into separate pieces, subdivided and then displaced. I'm also baking in detail max into the vertex color. So that's masks for curvature, ambient occlusion, and then I can use these in the Unreal material to add additional details. And then for the larger cliff segments, or rather the whole landscape, I actually split them up into smaller tiles for then importing into Unreal. And then, so here is that applied to the entire landscape. So each cliff is a separate tile which gets imported into Unreal. And then I can take these HDAs and set them up in PDG. So each cliff is an individual work item. So this way I can bring in the whole landscape and process cliffs for the entire landscape. So here is a single work item, which is this single piece of geometry. And just to go into a bit more detail on how those cliffs are generated. So this is the height field that gets loaded in, and that's the ID mask for the cliffs. It's converted into geometry, and then we get it subdivided and displaced. So this is using height maps from Megascans, displacing the geometry using the lab's triplanar displacement node. But this looks a bit too rigid, so I need to add some variation to break up those horizontal lines. So you can give it a bit of warping, and it gives a bit more of a natural look, so it kind of looks like some kind of geological folding. And then just to add some additional breakup, you can mix in a second displacement map. So this hides any potential tiling and also adds just a bit more visual variation. And then we have the final cliffs inside of Unreal. So all the kind of details coming from the nanite geometry. And in the material, we can use norm maps for kind of micro details. And then that's combined with the landscape's virtual textures, so we can blend the geometry seamlessly into the landscape. And then we could also use a similar workflow for placing procedural rockfalls or debris or kind of any procedural detail, and have that placement driven by these ID maps. And in this way, we can have a nice level of cohesion between the landscapes, its materials, and the placement of any procedural assets. And then finally, clouds. So Alex joined us a few weeks ago, and since then has been working on some workflows for taking clouds created in Houdini, bringing them into Unreal, and then crafting kind of multi-layered cloudscapes. So next you'll hear from Alex talking about some of that work.
Hi, I'm Alex Hamer, and I'm working on the volumetrics within Project Pegasus, with the goal of expanding Unreal's native volumetric cloud system to show that there are options for artists to create AAA quality cloudscapes without the need for third-party plugins. While a tool to paint the clouds already exists in Unreal natively, there is very little customization to it, as well as the fact that you can only draw on one height layer. This becomes a problem when you want to design your cloudscape in 3D rather than at one flat height. To create a system where an artist can input data from Houdini and have it become a real 3D cloud object that can transform freely, I used render targets to map out the cloud system into 256 layers. Each cloud object placed into the world will update its own dynamic material instance of where it is on the cloud space, allowing for the cloud system to read these and iterate through each frame with a volume texture from Houdini and draw it onto the render target. Normally, from here we would convert this into a volume texture so that it can be read easily by the engine. However, since we want customization and art direction to happen in as close to real time as possible, we use material functions to sample the render target as if it were a volume texture. After a little more material work and some calculations, a user can import a volume texture from Houdini and drop it straight into the world, creating cloud objects that accurately represent the shape of the cloud from Houdini, which can be moved around freely within the cloud space. This is currently in early stages of prototyping and doesn't yet represent the highest quality possible, and many more features are planned, such as having noise flow maps or tiling options, but it already allows users to have free control over how they want their cloud space to appear without having to rely on pre-baked textures or noise functions.
So it's still in early stages of prototyping, but for a few weeks' work, it's already showing a lot of promise for creating these kind of multi-layered cloudscapes. And recently with Unreal 5.3, they've added support for VDBs. So that's also something we kind of have on our radar to explore if time allows. So that's been a very kind of whirlwind look at Project Pegasus, and I've touched on as much as I could, but there's still a few things that I didn't have time to talk about. So now we just kind of want to get back and push the project through to completion and hopefully get it released for everybody to take a look at. We tried to approach the project in a holistic way, bring in Houdini to provide solutions as and when we saw them. So this has resulted in kind of a variety of different outcomes. So we've got HDA tools for use directly inside Unreal, or smaller kind of HDA utilities that we use in Houdini, and then workflows for PDG and procedural asset generation, and these new Foliage tools, which we're calling Flora. And then we're also utilizing Unreal 5.2, features such as PCG and Substrate. And then we've got an internal deadline to try and finish this environment by October, after which we need to then begin breaking down and kind of doing documentation. So I'm just saying kind of ambiguously late 2023 for release. But if you want to follow us and see some of the work that we're doing, you can follow the progress on sideeffects.com/Pegasus. So you can click on any of those thumbnails or any of our smiling faces, and you'll go through to our ArtStation blogs or YouTube, and you'll see kind of any of the content we've pushed out so far about what we're doing as we're working on it. That's it. Thank you very much. I think we have some time for some questions.
Hey, really great presentation. So you mentioned that you were using PCG and Houdini or Houdini Engine HDAs together. Can you talk a little bit about I had kind of viewed that as kind of an either or proposition. Can you talk a little bit about the logic, like which part of the proceduralism did Houdini control and PCG? How did they play nicely together?
So with that particular tool, it's not as such like it's directly integrated with one another as much as PCG is generating geometry, which we can then just import that as geometry straight into Unreal. So in that particular example, we're essentially using PCG to generate a set of points or cubes, which can then be turned to points inside Houdini. So that's like using PCG to go as one tool and then referencing it into a separate tool, which is the HDA that we've developed.
Any more questions?
Just a follow up to that. When you're using PCG, you can put attributes on the individual PCG points. When that gets ingested into Houdini Engine, do those stay? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, so it's just geo.
It's just geometry that's coming through, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Simple question. I know you don't want to speculate about release date too much, but since you mentioned it, would we expect it to basically be like in the next major version of Houdini, or would this be released as like a plugin or an update or something?
The timeline, I think, is independent from the Houdini versioning. So yeah, we'll release this as soon as it's ready.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
I have one more question. So you mentioned that you were using Substrate. Have you been doing any performance measuring on that?
No, we haven't. No.
Okay.
No more? I think that's it.
Cool. Thank you.